It happens inside their brains and bodies through the biologic mechanism of stress. Today, Turnaround works with leaders and teachers across the country, providing knowledge and tools, enabling educators to respond to the many adversities in children's lives, and enable students to fully engage in experiences, in relationships, and in learning. Today, we reach over 250,000 students and millions more through our field leadership, our 180 podcast that I hope you'll check out, our Edutopia video series on teacher practice, all directed toward putting powerful knowledge and tools about trauma, stress, development, and learning in the hands of all of the adults in all of the settings in which children grow and learn. And we put many of these together as a set of resources for you, which is available at turnaroundusa.org/Schusterman, and your password is BRAIN. I want to tell you something important that we learned after 9/11, and then I will turn to how this applies and doesn't apply to what we are experiencing now with COVID-19. In the immediate aftermath of 9/11, I was asked to help lead a study to assess the response to 9/11 in New York City's public school children. And the finding that surprised all of us at the time was that the most startling effects on children were not in the ground zero schools. They were in the children in schools in communities of deepest poverty. And I'll never forget walking into an elementary school in the South Bronx to a first grade class, where a teacher had asked her kids to do a drawing to help them digest 9/11. And a little boy named Thomas, who couldn't have been more than 6 years old, walked up to me with his picture. And in the background of his picture were these little boxes with smoke coming out. But in the foreground were two stick figure boys with guns pointed at each other. The message in Thomas's drawing was clear. It said, "I'm scared of the violence I see every day when I come to school. I'm scared to come to school, and 9/11 is very far away." So it was the immediate local context of this child's life that was producing fear, stress, and activating the biologic mechanisms we'll be talking about. And not surprisingly, these symptoms were most intense where the system had been activated before because of prior trauma. Today, the stress children are experiencing and witnessing is in all of our homes. Post 9/11, I went to visit classrooms all across the city, and I saw that educators were trying to do everything in their power to improve academics, but seeming to be unaware of the effects of stress on exactly those parts of the brain that are involved in learning. This is why I founded Turnaround, to create the conditions, the tools, the practices that could turn any school into a positive developmental and academic environment in children's lives, one that would develop the capabilities and talents of the whole child, no matter their zip code or their start in life. So unlike 9/11, this pandemic is not happening to some of us. It's happening to all of us. And there are some similarities for sure with COVID, but there are differences. 9/11 was this one horrible day, and it did change many aspects of our life. But COVID-19 has already been with us for weeks and weeks, and will likely be with us for a long time to come. And kids are likely to be moving back and forth between home and school. But what is most different about COVID are all the uncertainties, especially about the timeline. Is this a new normal? Is there going to be a next normal? And one after that with changes still to come? I don't know about you, but how many times have you been asked a question that begins with the words, "How long?" And we really don't know the answer. And then there is what I call the COVID paradox, because today, in order to be physically safe and keep others safe, we must be physically distant. And that means disrupting some of the most important communities in children's lives, their classrooms, their relationship to teachers, their teams and coaches, their friends, and we're even separated from our own kids. The very connections that all of us need to feel safe, to manage stress and fear, and to build our resilience or to this crisis and to what the future holds. All of it has been disrupted. So right now, I'm going to give you a primer about what stress does to the learning center of the brain, because stress is the most commonly occurring example that we have of negative context. When we experience stress, cortisol is released through our brains and our bodies, and it produces that feeling of fight, flight, or freeze. It's intense when it happens, but if the stress is mild or tolerable, it's adaptive. It actually makes us alert and sharp, and it helps us prepare for an event or a test or a performance. This is our limbic system at work: attention, concentration, focus, memory. But when children have persistently high levels of stress, and when that stress is not buffered by a trusted, calm adult, something else can happen. Children can get locked in that fight-flight feeling where it just doesn't let up. Cortisol can do a lot of harm to the structures in the brain that regulate focus, attention, emotion, the limbic system, because as we said, adversity doesn't just happen to children. It happens inside their brains and bodies through the biologic mechanism of stress. But fortunately, that's not the end of the story. There's a big upside when we turn to another hormone, the hormone oxytocin, because this is the hormonal system that produces feelings of trust, of love, of attachment, and safety. And that's not all. Oxytocin hits the very same structures in the brain as cortisol. Yet oxytocin is the more powerful hormone because it literally can protect children at the level of the cell from the damaging effects of cortisol. That's right, relationships that are strong and positive that can cause the release of oxytocin not only help children manage stress, offset the damaging effects of cortisol, they actually produce resilience to future stress. So when we speak of the human relationship, we're not just talking about being nice to a child. We're speaking of a connection that is built through consistent caring, protection, presence, and trust. One that can make a child believe something about themselves that they couldn't believe until you entered their life. In fact, the human relationship and oxytocin are the most powerful example we have of positive context. So when you put all of this together, what this means is that our brain is a dynamic living structure that is made up of tissue that is the most susceptible to change from experience of any tissue in the human body. And there are only three things that you have to remember about brain development: the brain's astounding malleability, experience-dependent growth, and the role of context. And because of this, there's no such thing as a developing child independent of context. Now, it is this single point that carries the enormous opportunity we have, because we are all brain builders. We are. Because of this, we can build environments in our classrooms and even in our homes that develop the interests, the passions, the skills, and the mindsets of the whole child. I wonder how many of you are familiar with the Marshmallow Test. I suspect many of you are. It was a test conducted back in the 70s in a nursery school at Stanford. And the nursery school children were put in a room and given a marshmallow and then a choice: eat the marshmallow right away or wait 15 minutes and get a second marshmallow. The research findings on the children who could delay gratification and exert self-control for this length of time were correlated with all kinds of successes: high school graduation, higher SAT scores, college acceptance, even later success in life. Let's take a look at how it went. So now let's fast forward to 2012. Dr. Celeste Kidd was a researcher then at the University of Rochester who had worked in a homeless shelter. And she asked herself the question, would any of my kids from the homeless shelter have ever waited to get a second marshmallow? So this researcher repeated the marshmallow test, but under a different set of conditions. She put the kids in a room with a bunch of broken crayons on the table. And she said that she would come back with a brand new set of crayons. And in half the cases, that's exactly what she did. The kids got new crayons. But in half, the researcher came back and said, sorry, I don't have any after all. Then she repeated the marshmallow test. Well, what do you think happened? Well, the kids who got the new crayons, where the promise was kept, waited, no problem waiting to get that second marshmallow. But for the kids where the promise was broken, well, they gobbled up that first marshmallow right away. So the ability to delay gratification, it turns out, has a lot to do with whether you trust the person giving you the marshmallow. But here's the really important thing. Dr. Kidd challenged the assumptions in the original test. She made the leap to understanding that self-control, this skill that is so important to learning, is not just in the child. It's in the child in a context designed to reveal the skill. In this case, through the experience of a trustful relationship. This researcher altered the microenvironment around these children. And by doing that, she was able to reveal the skill, the malleable skill of self-control that these children actually had. And she did this by establishing trust with them. So think about what this story means, about the environments we could create to reveal the potential skills and talents that exist in all learners. And think about the talents we as adults often don't see and won't see unless we design the environments to reveal them. So in 2017, we were among the leaders of a group of educators and researchers and scientists in an initiative called the Science of Learning and Development Alliance. It came with lead funding from the Chan Zuckerberg organization around answering a question. Okay, if we're going to design a 21st century education system using 21st century science, what science should we be paying attention to? Well, the findings were summarized in 3 important papers, and they're all available to you on the resource page. But the big aha was realizing that our 20th century system truly was never designed to develop the whole child, never designed to develop the learner, never designed for equity, and never designed to unleash student potential. The scientific knowledge we have today calls for a shift that goes straight to the purpose of education. And what the science is saying is clear. It is saying that the purpose of education should be the comprehensive development of the whole child and the learner inside that child. So how do we do that? The science calls for a design mapped to the way the brain learns, a design that combines positive relationships, environments filled with safety and belonging, integrated supports, the intentional development of critical skills, mindsets, and habits that all successful learners have, and rich, meaningful instructional experiences in which students discover what they're truly capable of. These are the 5 non-negotiables for whole child design. And the development of a whole child emerges when we combine these elements into experiences that connect to one another. And if you want to picture this, picture a shape like a web of experiences, because this is how our brains actually develop. Lots of connections that happen between the structures of the brain. And it is these connections that produce increasingly complex skills. A great example of this is how we learn to read. First, we're read to. We learn to recognize letters and how letters form words and sounds, and create images and feelings. And plus, we like the feeling of being read to. But each part of learning how to read involves different brain structures that get wired together through the experience of learning to read. And eventually, we become able to do this complex thing called reading. This is how our brains become integrated and wired to produce any complex skill. Take a look at this PET scan of a brain reading and look at the structures that light up. You have sight, you have hearing, you have expression, and you have comprehension. Experiences that grow our brains can happen everywhere. In school, at home, in communities, in ball fields, everywhere that children grow and learn. And today, in the time of the COVID pandemic, this especially means our homes. Settings designed with this knowledge about how children learn are like an ecological vaccine. Rachel used this word, and I'm going to use it again. These are environments that are rich in protective factors, that ignite the developing brain, that promote wellness, that protect children from the damaging effects of stress, all at the same time. But the wheel is a circle, and we're going to talk about each of these components. But which is the first? Well, for human development and learning, it matters what you do first, second, and third. And relationships are first. And we've talked about why, because relationships are the fuel for brain development. They're the fuel for learning, and they are the fuel for managing stress. So I'm going to show you a couple of videos, and this one is the first. It comes from a series of 23 videos that we did in collaboration with Edutopia, that's George Lucas's organization, and in partnership with Linda Darling Hammond, where we demonstrated how to do these whole child integrated practices, looking at classrooms across the country. And in fact, this one that you're about to see is from Van Ness Elementary School in DC. And you should know that since the launch of this series last January, a year ago January, it has had over 11 million views. Let's play the video.
Jeremy, we can't hear the sound.
Yep.
Strong relationships are central to the learning process.
It's very interesting.
The science of learning and development tells us that we need to create learning environments for children to become attached to school and to the adults and other children in it.
When children have experiences of closeness and consistency and trust, oxytocin is released. Oxytocin has many, many positive effects on the development of the brain. So when we think about a relationship, we're talking about a child having an experience strong enough to release the hormone oxytocin.
You all have done outstanding work.
If you're in a positive emotional space, if you feel good about yourself, your teacher, that actually opens up the opportunity for more learning.
Good to see.
Today, I was watching.
So next, we speak about safety and belonging. And we highlight this because in virtually every study of positive youth development, one finding is always at the top. Children can't engage, learn, or take risks when they don't feel physically, emotionally, and identity safe, when they don't feel like they're truly a valued part of the community that they're in. And when we say integrated supports, what we're talking about is a tiered support system, because a tiered support system will tip the balance toward an environment that is rich in protective factors, where students feel ready for learning. And here's what that means. A tiered support system is strong at every level, but especially tier 1, where the school-wide norms for safety, behavior, disciplinary practices are known and valued. A focus on developmental relationships, physical and emotional safety, wellness, and adults who know about the developing brain and how kids learn. A strong tier 2 has sheltered time in the schedule for teachers to meet together to discuss students and to create classroom-based scaffolds and interventions. And then you have tier 3, which is that multidisciplinary team where faculty come together to talk about the mental health needs of kids and to make sure there are strong partnerships with mental health and health providers. But if you don't create this 3-tiered system with strength at all 3 levels, you know that what you're going to do is load tier 3 to the point where it can't manage the capacity. Complex skill and mindset development is based on this framework, which is called the building blocks for learning. Now, it was developed by Brooke Stafford Brizard when she was at Turnaround, and it lays out all the skills that are essential for learning. And one of the things we realized when we built this is that there are multiple pathways through which all children can acquire these higher order skills like self-direction, perseverance, resilience, if we intentionally develop them. Now, I'm going to take you on a deeper dive into the building blocks in just a minute or two. But our 5th component for whole child design, our 5th non-negotiable, are rich instructional experiences. And I want you to understand what I mean by that, because these are the kinds of instructional experiences that fully engage and challenge us, where we discover what we are capable of. So I want you to think for a minute and use the chat. Think about how you discovered what you were capable of. What and who was part of that experience for you? And put a couple of those recollections in the chat to share. But a person who actually studied this was a Russian psychologist named Lev Vygotsky in the 1930s. He wrote about this when he described something called the zone of proximal development. This is a zone of development just beyond what we believe we can do. But then we discover we can do it because there was an adult who saw it first and provided just a little bit of support or belief or scaffold, and then we could do it. And the distance between what we believe we can do and what we can do with support, this is our developmental range. Every single human skill has a developmental range of performance. So when we speak of this thing called student potential, it's real, because we're literally speaking of operationalizing developmental range by making that range visible to the student and the adult. Vygotsky believed that this was at the heart of all great teaching. So how do we do that? How does any child become an engaged, productive learner? And how do they build these increasingly complex skills? Whether it's the skill to do a thorny algebra word problem or write a beautiful composition. This is the question that Brooke was trying to answer with a small team of us at Turnaround when she built the building blocks framework. And we're going to go a little deeper in that. She asked herself, could there be pathways like there are for reading or math? Because if such pathways existed, we could design classrooms and practices to develop these skills in all kids. And as I said, every skill in this framework, every skill in this framework is malleable, which means it can be built. Each one of them is highly correlated in the research with academics. It shows a developmental progression beginning with foundational skills, the ones you see at the bottom. Things like self-regulation, executive function, relationship and social skills. And then right above that, the critical mindsets for school, like growth mindset and belonging. And then those higher order skills that we want all children to have, like agency and perseverance and self-direction. So in practice, this framework shows us that we could develop these powerful skills for learning from any starting point. But there's more, because when you look at those bottom two rows, those are the skills that are supposed to be well established when a child enters kindergarten so that they're ready for school. Yet many children have uneven development of these skills because of the effects of stress that we've been talking about, and they can arrive at kindergarten unready for learning. So when we think about this pandemic and its effects on learning, this is where you will see it. It will happen in children's ability to focus and concentrate, their working memory, how they regulate their emotions. And for sure, when they return to school, these are the skills that they are going to need. And we intentionally have to build them, because not only are children at risk to be unready for learning as early as kindergarten, they're at risk to fall behind with experiences of disruption to their learning caused by COVID. But if they are intentionally built, then we can build these essential higher order skills that they will need to be successful in school and work and life. So in Brooke and we developed this framework, we had one major purpose in mind, which was to show that there are different pathways to become an effective, successful learner from any developmental starting point, including one that involved trauma. Now, you may know this, but the word trauma is a stigma to children who have it. No one who has it wants to have it, and they don't want to be known as having had it. No one wants to be taught by somebody where they feel labeled. This sets up a relationship that is deficit-oriented from the beginning. Now, we want to know that trauma is something that can cause an interruption in our lives. Yes, it can cause an interruption in skill development, but what do we most want to know? That is that it can be fixed, that it can be addressed. And that's what we want to know here, that we can address this disruption and we can do it without stigma. So this is the usual point when I give a presentation where a teacher might be thinking, okay, so how am I going to do all of these things on top of what I'm being asked to do? And the answer is that every single thing I've been speaking about are practices where teaching skills can be combined with teaching content. So I'm going to show you one last video from the video series with Edutopia. And this is a teacher in a middle school in Portland, Maine, who partnered with one of her students to teach an entire class executive function skills. And as you watch this video, take note of how many practices you see of the ones that we've been talking about and write them in the chat. Let's play the video.
Okay, so which one of those things is probably, okay, so which one of those things is probably going to be your frog?
Mark Twain said, if you wake up every morning and eat a frog, everything else will taste great. So I taught them to take their frog from the list, which is the thing they want to do the least, and get it out of the way, because everything else will seem easy.
A frog is like the most important assignment, like it's the one I'm really worried about.
Dry ice. So okay, you got to do that. What's your frog?
It helps me like realize I need to get this done faster than I need to get this done. So even though this is more fun, I need to get this out of the way before I can do this.
So as soon as we're done with that priority list, I notice everyone gets right to work because they have it spelled out very clearly for them.
So let's name what we see. I mean, we see relationships. We see a culture of safety and belonging. We see strategies that grow and enable rich instructional experiences. partly by teaching the intentional skill, the crucial skill of executive function and prioritization. So bringing this kind of skill development to life in a classroom means classrooms designed for relationships and teamwork, adults trained to know how the brain grows and how learning happens, and integrated tools to make it easier for teachers to teach rigorous content and develop the skills of a curious, self-directed learner at the very same time. But right now, we're in the middle of a stress-inducing pandemic, and the good news is that all of the practices that we've been talking about are great for development, they're great for learning, and they're great for managing stress. But historically, and you know this, there has been a false choice in education between the things we need to do on social and emotional development, physical and mental health, and the pursuit of academic excellence. Well, not today. It's all one thing. And the non-negotiables for whole child design will cover all of the important bases for the adults as well as the kids. The neurobiological story here is simple. The brain is malleable. It is the tissue in the human body that is the most susceptible to change from experience of any tissue in the human body. A brain under stress is shut down. It can't focus, it can't concentrate, and it doesn't have access to its full working memory, and it gets easily triggered by emotions. The way our brains are wired, it is our emotions that drive our cognitive and learning skills. It is our emotions that engage us or shut us down. So today, we have no choice. The path to a calm classroom is a calm brain. The path to learning is a calm brain. And the path to both of these is to prioritize activities that build relationships, establish routines, and promote resilience. And everything that we're going to talk about right now, we can prioritize at home and as we prepare for re-entry to school, and all of them are drawn from the non-negotiables we've just talked about for whole child design. So let's start with relationships. Gretchen, are you ready?
I'm ready.
So relationships are the active ingredient in the learning environment because they are the way trust is built, oxytocin is released, the limbic system is activated. You now know all of these things. And in fact, trust is the antidote to stress, and relationships are the medium through which we experience trust. So Gretchen, how do we build relationships?
Well, this is not going to, I often say this, it's not rocket science, it's brain science. It's something that we already do. I'm thinking back to my teaching credential program, and one of the things I don't have on my turnaround page is I was also a master or mentor or collaborating teacher for 14 of the 17 years that I taught. So had a lot of student teaching interns in my room. And what they always came very prepared with was their lesson plan. But what they didn't come prepared with was, how am I going to get to know every single student in my classroom? And so preparing new teachers with a guide for how they can do this, a classroom huddle, starting with a warm welcome that is the same every day, having a banking time schedule where you make sure that you have every one of your students listed, and you make sure that throughout the week you have a relational touch point with them, not checking in with them about their homework or did they get the assignment done, but how are you? And really listening. And if we can create a whole new group of teachers who go into the profession attuned to their individual students and willing to listen to how they are, and starting every day with a predictable huddle, that would be brilliant. And I hope I said a couple of the things that are going to come on the slides. There we go. Oh, one thing that I didn't mention, which was something that I absolutely loved and I designed into the school I built, was looping structures. As much as possible, if you can keep students in relationship with teachers that they come to know and love. And I saw in the chat from Joy, her kindergarten teacher who followed her through elementary school and then showed up at her 6th grade graduation with a pillow that she made for her. Those kinds of enduring relationships set students up for success far after the relationship, the closeness of it may have ended, but that lingering warm feeling goes on and on. Next.
Okay. So now we're going to talk about routines. And it might not be obvious yet, but believe it or not, the brain is a prediction machine. It actually loves order. It's calm when things are orderly, when it knows what's coming next. But it gets anxious and agitated when things are not predictable. So routines are our path to a calm brain. Gretchen, how do we build them?
Routines are ways that students understand what happens 1, 2, and 3 after they come into the classroom. They know how to come in, they know where to put their stuff down, they know that they're going to get into a circle, they know that at some point someone's going to ask them how they are during that day, that there's an agenda that they will see, and that if that happens every single day, that when they come in, no matter where they are, if they had a terrible morning, a terrible night, it will help to reset their amygdala, open up their hippocampus, their prefrontal cortex, and they'll be ready to go. And when you can do it, encourage your new teachers to co-create these routines and procedures with their students. And as time goes by, you will notice that the teachers don't have to keep working with those and reminding students. Students will begin to remind each other as the year goes by. And it's so important to do these every day, even when it feels urgent to get straight to work. Remembering to go back into these routines to reset the brain, to get it ready for learning, so, so important.
Super. And the third is resilience. And resilience, you saw this malleable skill on that building blocks framework. Today, building resilience is likely the most important task we have for ourselves and our kids. And you might think that resilience is something you have or you don't, like eye color. But resilience can be built. Resilience is much more like a muscle. And the key to building resilience, resilience is very, very much tied to first knowing that all of us have strengths. We're not starting from a blank slate. But the key to building resilience is actually building all of our regulation skills. There's abundant research on this. Our physical, emotional, behavioral, cognitive, regulating skills. And we do this through co-regulating activities with others. Gretchen?
Yep. And one of the ones that we are really using and encouraging people to think about right now is this concept of emotional response strategies. And let me just talk you through this for a moment. This has been a time that's been very dysregulating for many people. In a moment when you are feeling very regulated, come up with some of the emotions that you're feeling during this time and try to be as specific as possible. I'm feeling stressed. I'm feeling lonely. I'm feeling detached. List the emotions that you're feeling. And then also think about the self-care resources you have in your toolbox. How do you resource yourself? And simply post those and realize that when you're feeling detached or lonely, you actually love to go on a walk with your dog. Because it's in the moments when we're really feeling our emotions that we cannot access our self-care resources because we have lost access to our hippocampus and our prefrontal cortex. And when you encourage children to do this, it begins to give them an emotional vocabulary. And I'm going to have to reference Mr. Rogers right now, who said, if it's manageable, if it's mentionable, it's manageable, right? If you can teach students to be able to name their emotions, and this works even for high school students. I was a high school teacher. If you can name how you're feeling, it's the first step to being able to manage that feeling. And if you can model that as an adult, that's co-regulation. Thanks.
As Dan Siegel says, one of our favorites, if you can name it, you can tame it.
Yes.
So you might wonder, why did we pick these three? Why are these the 3 R's? And I want to just be explicit about the secret sauce here. We said that the brain is a dynamic living structure. It's also an electrical structure, and electrical structures need fuel. The fuel for brain development comes from the hormones that are released in relationships. The brain becomes more and more wired. Remember that PET scan, because it is stimulated by relationships and rich learning experiences, preferably predictable ones. Routines, like these, routines that are predictable, build the wiring that produces complex skills, whether the skill is reading or resilience. So implementing the 3 R's will mean that the majority of the kids in your school will do better. They'll engage better as learners. They will have calm brains. They will become resilient over time. And the number of kids who will need individual interventions or who will be in crisis in the classroom will go down. This is why we picked these specific 3 R's as the most important practices to focus on. So I have one final thought to share with you. I want us to remember any book, any story we have ever read about a person who has successfully surmounted adversity and gone on to do amazing things. There's always one consistent ingredient that made it happen. It was a person who never gave up on them, had their back, expressed their belief, loaned them courage at a crucial moment, but it wasn't an accident. This is the power each of us carries today, to be that person for a young person, for each other, in our lives at home and when we return to school. Thank you all very much for giving us this opportunity to talk to you.